Welcome to the 2022 DiLCo Lecture Series on Digital Language and Communication. I am Yanis Androutopoulos from the University of Hamburg. DiLCo is a 3-year scientific network on digital language variation in context, initiated in 2021. It is coordinated by my colleague Heike Zinsmeister, who is also here, and myself at the University of Hamburg, and currently includes scholars from universities in the US, UK, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Denmark. DiLCo is generously supported by the University of Hamburg within the Universities of Excellence scheme funded by the German federal government and the federal states. DiLCo aims to stimulate scientific exchange between various approaches to digital language and communication research within linguistics and to bridge gaps between qualitative and quantitative research methods. To this purpose, we organize online and on-site activities such as conference panels, methods workshops, and this DiLCo Lecture Series. Our lectures showcase cutting-edge international research by both senior and younger scholars who draw on key concepts in sociocultural linguistics, including community, context, identity, interaction, style, multimodality, linguistic change, and others to shed light on digital communication. We are recording these lectures to build up a repository that is available open access from Hamburg University's video portal called Lecture2Go. Please visit our website for more information on how to retrieve the recorded lectures. As in the past, each lecture goes for about 40 minutes, followed by discussion. Feel free to post questions and comments into the chat during the lecture. I'm now delighted to introduce today's speaker, Christian Ilbury from the University of Edinburgh. Christian completed his MA and PhD in linguistics at Queen Mary University of London. His doctoral thesis, completed in 2019, was based on an ESRC-funded project on social media and the social meaning of variation in East London, and was supervised by Erez Levon and Colleen Cotter. Christian is currently a lecturer in sociolinguistics at Edinburgh and has also had appointments at the University of Suffolk, Regent's University in London, and Queen Mary. Christian's scholarship is grounded on a third-wave approach to sociolinguistic variation and brings this into connection with digital discourse and digital literacy practices. As he writes on his own blog, his work explores the intersection of digital culture and language variation and change, mainly with a focus on the linguistic and media practices of young people. Christian has published in journals such as Journal of Sociolinguistics, Language and Society, Discourse, Context and Media, as well as in edited volumes and handbooks. His talk today, called Between the Macro and the Micro, Using Computational Tools to Better Understand Sociolinguistic Issues, addresses, I believe, issues of methodological synergy and exchange that are central to the aims of the DiLCo network. So thank you, Christian, for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much for inviting me and also for that very kind introduction. So I'm going to share my slides, so if you can just say yes, that you can see them. I assume that's yes? Yes, great, cool. Okay, so I'm going to start a clock so that I can see what I'm running to. But yeah, today I'm just going to talk about the macro and the micro in exploring digital communication. And I'm going to focus on the distribution and social meanings associated with a new multi-ethnolect and multicultural London English. And to do this, I'm going to be talking about 2 projects that I've been involved with. So, okay. Right, so when I talk about macro and micro, I'm intentionally creating a dichotomy here where a dichotomy might not necessarily exist, or at least hopefully by the end of my talk, you'll agree that one doesn't need to exist. So in terms of macro, I'm talking about computational sociolinguistic approaches, well, recent approaches that basically look at the distribution, the social distribution or linguistic distribution of a orthographic variable, usually with relation to some macro level. So that's like survey or demographic factors such as age, gender, and ethnicity. And in some ways, this work kind of reminds of what has been termed first wave sociolinguistic research. in the literature, such as in the work by Eckert. On the other hand, we have what I'm referring to as micro approaches, and we've heard from researchers who use these approaches, and obviously, Yanis, your work is heavily influenced by the interactional approach. And the kind of main method here is that you examine the interactional function of a linguistic feature with relation to some kind of micro level factor. And so this might be what's going on in the discourse, how someone is constructing their identity, or in its modern conceptualization, the notion of style. And what I'm going to argue today is that we don't need one or the other, but we need both to understand digital communication. There's obviously huge potential to combine these approaches, and I'm probably preaching to the choir of DiLCo. I mean, this is the entire point of this project. And it's something that I've argued in earlier work, and I'm probably not the first person to argue this, but I'm a junior scholar, so here's a quote from me that feel free to cite. In my 2019 paper, I argued that micro approaches to studying language variation in social media should complement large-scale macro methodologies in order to fully explore how sociolinguistic identities manifest in digital settings. In that incredibly verbose statement, I basically mean we need to combine macro and micro approaches. Like I say, I'm not the first person to argue this. Work by Bahman and colleagues, for instance, shows the utility of combining approaches. So when they look at gender differences in digital communication, they find that things that can't be explained by macro level trends can be explained by kind of more micro level factors. In this case, the gender homophily of the social networks of individual users. In other words, users with less gender homophilous networks use less gendered language or stereotypical gendered language. Like I say, there's now a huge body of work which is attempting to combine these approaches. So really, I'm speaking to a discussion or a debate that is ongoing in the literature. So today, essentially what I'm going to do is juxtapose or bring in two studies, project one with colleagues Jack Grieve and David Hall on the distribution of multicultural London English lexis, and then a project that I have under review looking at the stylization of multicultural London English. And what I'm going to try and do is show that by bringing both approaches, both the macro and the micro, we can fully understand the newly emerged multi-ethnolect, multicultural London English in all of its forms. Okay, so probably not all of you grew up in London, if not very few of you, and probably less of you have an understanding of what multicultural London English is. So I would just give you a brief idea of what this is. So it's a new multi-ethnolect that was first documented by Paul and Jenny and colleagues in 2008. It's described in that work as a multi-ethnolect spoken by young working class individuals residing in inner city neighbourhoods in London. It's now spoken elsewhere, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But at least at the time of writing in 2008, this was pretty much a good characterization of what was going on. So by multi-ethnolect, if you're not familiar with that term, it basically means a variety spoken by individuals from a range of different ethnic backgrounds. And one of the main conclusions of that work is it's an ethnically neutral, variable repertoire. So kids with so-called Anglo, that is British heritage, and non-Anglo, i.e. elsewhere heritage, use MLE and speak MLE. It is in some sense the kind of Lebovian vernacular spoken by young working class kids in London today. And the earlier work in 2008 and 11 demonstrated that it wasn't the ethnic identity of the individual that predicted the use of MLE, but rather the use of MLE was better predicted by the ethnic diversity of their friendship networks. So you saw that kids with more ethnically diverse friendship networks use more MLE features. So to give you an idea of some of the features, I'm not going to be talking about all of these, but it's a good idea to have an idea of what this sounds like and what kind of features make up. So you get the monoptization of diphthongs, such that a word like face might become something more like fis. You get the emergence, and everybody gets very excited about this when I talk about it, the emergence of a new pronoun. So instead of saying I, so first person, you could say man said 129. And then a huge amount of lexis, which I'm going to talk about in more detail. But I'm not an MLE speaker. I'm from London. I don't speak MLE. So here's somebody from my fieldwork who did, or who does.
What did they tell you off for, though?
For looking at people.
For looking at people?
Being rude, like, with them words.
With them words?
I'd be like, a thing.
So that was probably quite quiet, but hopefully, judging by the fact that no one said anything, you can probably hear that. So there's an MLE speaker. More recently, research elsewhere in England by Rob Drummond has shown that there are very similar features between what we've referred to as multicultural London English and the variety spoken by young people there. And so he's argued that we're not looking at multicultural London English, but we're looking at a broader vernacular or variety that he refers to as multicultural British English, originally urban, that's been dropped. And he defines this as an overarching variety or repertoire of shared features, with each urban centre then having its own local version or sub-variety. So what it seems then is that multicultural London English might have diffused, or there might have been some kind of simultaneous development of varieties elsewhere, given the comparable demographic makeup of somewhere like London and Manchester, which are quite diverse cities. So this is where I talk about the first project. I'm going to talk about this much more briefly than the second one, because some of you have probably heard me prattle on about this before. But the first project is called Using Social Media to Infer the Diffusion of Multicultural London English Lexis. So I'm focusing on the diffusion of MLE lexis here. And this is the macro approach. So in this project, what we're asking is, can a huge amount of Twitter data tell us more about the possible diffusion of MLE lexis beyond London? Because other than Rob Drummond's work, we don't really know a huge amount about where MLE has spread to and where it's used. There's some work by Sue Fox and colleagues that documents it in Birmingham. That was much earlier on. And similarly, we would want to know whereabouts in the UK is this spoken. So I now live in Scotland. Is it spoken in Scotland? And one of the ways we can kind of infer this is through Twitter data. And what we would like to know is, are there distinct geographical patterns of MLE lexis? So MLE is heavily influenced by Caribbean Englishes, so Jamaican English, for instance, in terms of the lexis. And one of the questions that we had is, can we actually distinguish what we're referring to as MLE from, say, Jamaican English, or do they just basically pattern in the same way? And so this leads on to the third question, is because parts of MLE have kind of become almost like a youth vernacular norm, particularly the lexis. So today it's very common to hear like young people, regardless of whether they have the phonology of MLE, call things like leng or peng or whatever, which basically means nice. So can we distinguish between what we're referring to as like a MLE repertoire and what could be considered youth vernacular? I mean, for instance, perhaps I would say that that shoe or that car is butters, which is, it means ugly. And butters is technically from MLE, but I would suggest that, you know, as a 30-year-old, I probably am not using this in the same way as young people. So can we distinguish between those forms? Okay, so like I said, this is the macro part, and it really is quite big. We're using Jack Brief's very large corpus here of 180 million geolocated tweets, totaling 1.8 billion words from 1.9 million unique user accounts. This was collected in 2014. I can say more about why this date later on. Like I said, Jack downloaded these tweets using the API function, the API access even, between the 1st of January 2014 and the end of the year, and they were geolocated to the UK. And myself and Dave, who have both worked on multicultural London English, so I have done fieldwork. Dave is an MLA speaker to an extent, and I grew up in the area as well. We, as linguists who have worked on this variety, developed a list of what we consider to be stereotypical MLE words, what are Jamaican Creole words, and then what terms we would consider to just be in general circulation amongst young people. And basically, we're using the metadata, the geolocation metadata, to plot the tweets in a given location. So what we're assuming is that a higher frequency of the word in an area would suggest that a word got there earlier. So from that, we can assume that there is some kind of, we can work out how MLE lexis has diffused across the UK. So here is a word, an MLE word, pagan, which means something like enemy or untrustworthy. So you could use it in a sentence like, he's a pagan. And if you listen to grime music, which is a form of electronic rap that emerged in East London, you're probably very familiar with this term. And the way that you interpret these graphs basically is the darker the red, the higher prevalence of that term. So like I said, what we're assuming here then is if there's a higher prevalence of that term, it's likely to arrive there earlier. So the areas where they're kind of white or peachy are areas where the word is used very infrequently and therefore probably hasn't spread there yet. And what you should be able to see is what we would expect. There's a high prevalence of the term in London, as denoted by this inset here. Hopefully you can see my mouse waving around, not mouth. And then you can kind of see this corridor of diffusion up through an area called Luton. There's an airport there if you've ever flown with a budget airline, EasyJet. Up into Northampton, into Birmingham. As I said earlier, there's some work that's already established that parts of or features of MLE were being used in Birmingham, and then less so into the north west. What you should really take note of is where I live now in Scotland. There's not a huge amount of MLE, and Northern Ireland, no, not high frequencies of this word, right? So pagan seems to be kind of restricted to the south and up through this corridor. So cool, we have looked at the diffusion of one word, but how does this hold for other words? Leng is also an MLE word. It means something like nice, fit, and attractive. So you could say like that girl's leng or that car's leng. Yeah, I'm not an MLE speaker, so sorry for the inauthenticity. And again, what you should be able to see, high frequencies of this word in the south and upward spread into the northwest, into Manchester. So again, an area where MLE lexis has been tracked. Again, we see this kind of almost hard border between Scotland and England, where there is lower frequencies of leng in the cities of Edinburgh and Glasgow, for instance. If you look at the inset of London, this is even more interesting because it shows that it isn't evenly distributed across London. Rather, these kind of top three on the right-hand side, so the East London boroughs, show higher prevalence of this word than, say, the southwest regions. And that's kind of unsurprising. I'm originally from the southwest of London, and southwest of London is slightly different to the east and north of London. It's less ethnically diverse and it's much more affluent. So in terms of the original conceptualization of MLE, the areas that are showing high frequencies of this word are closer in kind of character. We can also distinguish the patterns that I've described so far, so these two MLE words, pagan and leng, from just a Jamaican English term. So this is gaudem, which, plural girls. If you're familiar with Jamaican English, you'll be very familiar with this word. And we see a slightly different pattern to what we've described so far in terms of MLE. So first or sure, there's high frequencies of this word in London and also in some areas where we saw high frequencies of MLE, but this word seems to be cropping up in areas where we didn't see high frequencies of pagan or leng. So let me draw your attention to the southwest city of Bristol, just down here under Cardiff. Hopefully you can see my mouse, otherwise you're probably desperately looking for where Bristol is on this map. But Bristol, let's just go back to Leng, doesn't show as high frequencies of MLE lexis, but when we get to Gowdem, shows high frequencies of this word. And unsurprisingly, Bristol is home to a very large African Caribbean population, so we would expect this distribution. Okay, so cool. So far we've discussed singular words, but what we really want to do is identify kind of coherent lexical repertoires. So let's look at some aggregate maps. So we base this on 47 words that are present in MLE. So we grouped ting, leng, ni'i, all these words, I can tell you more, together. We generally excluded polysemous words, so words with more than one meaning. And we basically we subjected the data to some transformations, and we undertook a principal component analysis. And basically this allows us to map the variance in the data and understand how the variance is accounted for. If you understand anything about principal component analysis, you'll know that this is a good thing. Basically, the first dimension accounts for almost half the variance in the dataset. What this means in layman's terms is there is mainly one pattern that accounts for most of the variation, so the distribution of the words, and I'll describe this in more detail. What this pattern is basically the MLE repertoire, and so we can identify by conducting this principal component analysis some postcodes that are linked to the pattern. In other words, postcodes that are highly correlated with the MLE repertoire. And these are, here are 5 initials that you probably don't understand, but they're basically all London postcodes except for the last one, which is Luton. And Luton is an area just outside of London that is similarly, in comparison to the London postcodes, is very similar in terms of its demographic makeup. We can also see which areas are not linked to the pattern, and unsurprisingly, these are kind of areas that are very far from London. Most of them are in the Outer Hebrides and the Shetland, so in Scotland and beyond. And they are very culturally and ethnically different areas to London, right? So many of these areas are mostly white British residents. We can also identify some words that are linked to the pattern. So we find that the 5 best candidates for the MLE repertoire are ting, fan, mandim, roadman, and clat. And we can also identify some words that are not linked with the pattern. And I can tell you more about this later on, but I'm just going to pass on now in the interest of time. So what does that all really mean? Well, this is our overall map that shows you the distribution of this kind of MLE repertoire, the 47 words. And what you should be able to see here is a really nice, consistent pattern of high frequencies of MLE lexis in the north and east of London, and also the south. This area is Croydon, as signaled by this inset map here. And as I was saying earlier, we see lower frequencies of MLE lexis in the southwest of the city, and that's probably unsurprising. So what it seems to suggest then is that MLE lexis, because of higher frequencies in these areas, appears to have emerged in North and East London and also possibly Croydon, and then spread upwards kind of through like the M1 corridor, so into an area like Luton, which is ethnically diverse, is home to a large Black British population, and then spread onwards to cities like Birmingham, for instance. So this suggests then that MLE lexis is diffused through the shared social networks of Black British speakers. So this throws into question the claim then that MLE, at least in terms of its lexical repertoire, is a ethnically neutral variable repertoire. Okay, so that just gives you a very quick overview of that paper. And now I'm going to talk about the other side of the analysis. So this is a second paper that takes a very different approach. And this is the micro level analysis of what's going on. And in this paper, what I'm interested in is the current the current recontextualization of multicultural London English with reference to a particular persona, or what Arga has referred to as characterological figure. So what do I actually mean? Right, so first of all, what I've just been speaking about, I've been talking about kind of her habitual speech or habitual repertoire, which sounds something like this.
I worked as a part-time shop manager. One of the things I did was submit orders of craft beer to our suppliers. One night while shopping in the supermarket, I noticed they had started to sell some of the beer that we stocked at a lower price than we had been able to order.
Cool. And in terms of recontextualization,
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
Going to continue talking. In terms of recontextualization, I'm now talking about moving away from that habitual repertoire to something like this. So you'll note first of all that this user, and this is a TikTok video, this user originally starts with their habitual repertoire and then shifts into a stylized repertoire or style. So I'm going to talk about that stylization.
I said to my boyfriend that if you speak to any other girl, I will kill you. And he said, you won't kill me. And I said,
I will literally end your life, fam. I'll fucking chef you up. Chef you into some pasta, put you in a spliff store. Don't fucking mess with me, fam, I lie.
Right, so the second part of that stylization, the deep voice, for instance, that includes a huge amount of MLE lexis and MLE phonological features. So I'm interested basically in what that persona is and how that persona has come about. Okay, so in terms of persona, in terms of what I'm talking about, lots of sociolinguistic research has started to look at how linguistic features coalesce and are bundled together as these kind of stylistic packages, and how they become ideologically associated with what has been referred to characterological figures. And so, for instance, the alley saunterer discussed by Zhang, the valley girl discussed by Pratt and D'Onfro, and then I've worked on personae as well. So my recent work on sassy queens and this year the Hun. And personae are really interesting because they allow us to explore the social conditions which bring them about and the ideologies that inform social difference, right? How we perceive one another. And importantly, and this is why I like studying them in terms of social media, is for a characterological figure to work, it must be able to be performed through semiotic display or enactment. And I mean, you know, social media is incredibly performative. These kind of performances are pretty stock if you just open up TikTok. So this is what I'm going to be talking about. And I'm also going to be talking about how speakers stylize personae. So this suggests that speakers are adopting basically a style that is beyond their habitual repertoire or style. So it is defined as taking features or kind of appropriating those features momentarily and is kind of distinct from what is typically perceived to be conventional for the speaking context. So speakers may stylize personae in a given interaction, such as the Babu persona discussed by Ben Rampton in his work on crossing. And we can distinguish between so-called unidirectional crossing or stylization and very directional. And today, I think what I'm going to be talking about is very clearly very directional. It is not intended to align with the persona or characterological figure. It is very clearly a parody. So stylized interactions are interesting for us as sociolinguists because they are informed by and reproduce social relations, right? They tell us about the ways in which we perceive other people. And importantly, social media are great places to explore this because stylized performances can reconfigure existing indexable links. So for example, Yanis's work on German dialect in YouTube, for instance, shifts the kind of focus away from the male speaker of the dialect. And I'm arguing that social media as staged performance are basically interesting sites because they're put on display, right? And they are intended to be consumed by non-local users. So if you've never heard of MLE before, even me remediating some of this stuff, you are now seeing British people performing MLE to a non-local audience, right? It's a similar thing with British people now engaging with mediatizations of African-American vernacular English in ways that are just not possible before. I'm talking about recontextualization, and basically what this is where signs appear in new contexts. So the very obvious example, and example that has been studied in great detail, is how African-American vernacular English, as a variety of English spoken generally by some working class Black African-Americans, has been recontextualized or resemiotized as hip-hop nation language. So it acquires new social meanings and then becomes associated with a particular media style in this instance. So I'm looking at TikTok, not because I spend probably way too much time on this platform, but it's also the most popular social media platform for Gen Z, so the generation below me. Unfortunately, I'm not part of that generation. My youth is slipping away. But these are really interesting. Well, it's an interesting platform because of the short time limit of these videos. It encourages kind of the stylized interactions I'm talking about. So you can upload basically a short video from 15 seconds to 3 minutes. And I mean, you can be on there hours learning how to, I don't know, redecorate your house, and also, you know, how to tie new shoelaces and stuff like this. It really is diverse in content. And the videos, like other social media platforms, are organized in so-called thematic channels by hashtags. So if I was interested in hashtag London, I could click on that and then see a load of videos related to London. And basically, since my fieldwork, and since becoming interested in this persona, I've been sitting on TikTok, not just for my own purposes, but no, I've been conducting a digital ethnography over the course of 2 years, where I've basically been interrogating what this persona is and what it means. So when I finally got round to analysing the videos, I've scraped 500 of them. All of these videos are hashtag Roadman. So like I said, it's kind of already an unregistered persona. And what I'm going to be talking about is how these videos orient towards that persona using a Python package called TikTok API. It's very easy. TikTok's API is very open. I removed any videos that weren't related to this hashtag because it's very common for people to use this hashtag because it's very popular. So there were videos in there that had nothing to do with the performance that I'm describing, but nevertheless were hashtagged as such. And as much as I would have liked to use digital transcription methods, automated transcription methods, they were unfortunately incredibly pointless on this data. It includes backing tracks. MLE is probably not the best dialect, even when spoken authentically, to analyze using digital transcription methods. So I transcribed these 373 videos myself. Okay, so before I get going, I have to make you aware that the term roadman wasn't invented on TikTok. It wasn't invented on social media. It is long before kind of any platform came around. So it precedes social media. Even when I did field work in 2016, this was a pretty common term. When I was at school, you know, only yesterday, no, like what, 20 years ago or so, this was a common term that people used to call each other. But it literally means a man who does road, right? So in Jamaican English, you add man to your occupation. So sound man, road man, batty man, which unfortunately is a pejorative term for a gay man. And this emerges from Jamaican English. And it is rooted in a particular cultural orientation that has grown out of British culture, Black British culture, in fact, which is called road culture. And so people will say they're doing road, right? And this isn't kind of the asphalt thing that you drive along. It means kind of the everyday realities of working class life, like living in the neighborhood. And it is essentially then the Black British interpretation of what you might think of as street culture in the US. And increasingly, this has become more prevalent. So even Jeffrey Boashi writes that for some young men, it's kind of perversely aspirational stereotype that offers status from the margins. So some young people might emulate some of these features because it's cool. So to give you an idea of what roadman parodies look like, this is a very good example. Apologies for the likelihood of swearing.
Hello, this is BT Internet Customer Service.
Yeah, man knows who it is, fam. Man didn't just Google BT Internet Customer Service and expecting Kentucky Fried Chicken Saturday meal delivery service.
How can I help?
You can help by fixing man's internet, fam.
What seems to be the problem, sir?
The problem is that it don't work.
Okay, let me just pass you on to my...
Okay, so even in that clip, you should have been able to hear some lexical features, fam, for instance, and also the grammatical feature, man. So he's using that as a first person pronoun there. So lots of features of MLE, but also the phonology is pretty marked. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about first in terms of the general characteristics of roadman parody TikToks. So the first is that he's always male, or the performer is always intended to be male, even if the, character is always intended to be male, even if the performer is does not identify as male. And this is marked even to the extent that, like I said, the label roadman explicitly marked for gender, and also the kind of fictional names that are assigned to the individual. So Marcel, for instance. The race of the performer and also perhaps the character is variable because both Black and white individuals can potentially be roadmen. But importantly, it is linked to Blackness through the cultural orientation of road culture. Like I said, it's a Black British kind of creation, and also linguistic features that explicitly mark this character as Black. So for instance, I would discuss this in a minute, but the metathesis of ask, so ax, which in British English is explicitly marked as being a Black feature. He is also always in these kind of fictional situations where he's performed as hypermasculine and overtly sexual. So common tropes is, well, he's heterosexual, and he always basically references some kind of sexual advance. And there's, as we're seeing the Lexis used in these videos, there's common references to bunda, which is basically buttocks. And he's commonly performed as aggressive, right? So as this image on the right shows, how to avoid getting stabbed by a roadman. This is a common theme in the videos. And finally, he's often very much performed as criminal. Most of these videos make references to guns, knives, burglary, as the kind of real identity has some kind of reality. So the first part I'm going to talk about is what I refer to as linguistic stylization, and this is basically the way in which linguistic features are stylized to perform the roadman persona. So it's just through linguistic methods. So in this video, you'll hear a switch from a hyper-feminine American style to a hyper-masculine MLE style.
It's officially Christmas Eve, and you know what that means.
We can link up under the mistletoe, innit? Like, all I want for Christmas is you, fam. You're a painting a lie. Like, I'm on the nice list, babes, I swear, stop.
Okay, so the roadman persona is kind of evoked just through linguistic features, i.e. not through costume or other theatrical devices. So we can see lexis, link up, ally, discourse pragmatic features, and many phonological features which are typical of MLE. I contrast this with what I'm referring to as theatrical stylization, and this is basically the roadman characterological figure is evoked through multiple semiotic resources, so things like fashion or the costume of the character, voice modifiers, and music. So for instance...
Okay, yeah, have a good night. Don't worry, your little you's gonna be fine with me. Right, what do you wanna do?
Baby shark!
Baby shark? The fuck is that? Yo, I can flex to that still.
Right, so the costume that he's wearing is very clearly marked as the roadman style, and also the linguistic features that he's using are very typical of MLE, but nevertheless here are recontextualized and associated with a particular persona. Okay, so I'm not going to go over all of the linguistic levels, but I'm just going to show you these slides to show you that there is diversity in the linguistic features that are represented, but they're nevertheless very typical of MLE. So for instance, the monophthization of the price vowel in a word like line is, well, it's a monophthong, so it's pronounced something like lang, right? Give man your best cat up lang. But in terms of iconicity, one of the most interesting features is the pronoun man, which seems to be overshot. In fact, there's 862 tokens in just 373 videos, such that it becomes kind of a stereotype of this persona. So for instance, in this video, the roadman is positioned as a teacher who's undertaking a class on English grammar, and he fictionally, well, he kind of says that there's only one pronoun in the English language, right? So we can just watch this clip.
Come, alright, so today we're going to be moving on to a bit of grammar, like pronouns. In the English language, there's only one pronoun, man. Man. I never asked you to repeat that. So, one pronoun, man, for everything. Man is wearing a grey hoodie. Man is the teacher.
Right, so again, that feature that is very, very typical of MLE, we see it's kind of recontextualized here and associated with a particular figure. I'm going to skip over this slide because this one's probably more interesting. Most of the lexis that is used in roadman parodies references the criminal or violent orientation of the roadman. For instance, in this video, the roadman is adding words to a repertoire, and you'll hear most of them refer to the same concept, knife.
Alright, I've got a couple words to add to the repertoire, big man. Spit them, fam. Alright, let's start off with shank. Cool, cool. And that means knife. Cool, knife. And next is chef. Chef. And that means knife. Knife. Well, they both mean knife. Yeah, that means knife too. Okay. So what? The next one is quiff. Quiff. Let me guess. That means knife? Yeah. No, yeah, that means knife as well.
Okay, so I'm going to skip over the discourse features as well, but just know that there are a diversity of discourse features from MLE. So basically what we're looking at here then is a type of very directional voicing. It's not intended to align with the roadman figure, but rather it's intended to parody it. It is, in Arga's terms, a characterological figure. It's a stereotype of a particular persona that has an unregistered style associated with it. And importantly, this is performed for local and non-local audiences, right? Like kids and young people and other people from around the world are engaging with this characterological figure. It's not just people who have an awareness of MLE. And so what I'm arguing then is there's a type of recontextualization of these features where we've shifted from kind of an authentic kind of speech style to a specific cultural alignment and social figure. In fact, the recontextualization is so apparent that we almost kind of move from what we've defined as MLE to essentially roadman dialect, as is evident in this TikTok video where standard English sentences are translated into roadman dialect. So I'll just give you a brief overview of this and move on because I'm aware of the time.
I'm going to get some Nando's chicken with my friend. Gonna get a chicken Nando's with him, Mandem.
I mean, there's nothing inherent about Mandem to suggest that it's roadman dialect. It's MLE, but it has become recontextualized as, in this instance, roadman dialect. So social media are important because they're powerful agents of socialization. In other words, they mediate our understanding of speakers and their speech styles. And importantly, parodic performances shape users' perceptions of MLE and its speakers, in particular for those who have never met an MLE speaker in their life. And so what I'm arguing here then is that the themes referenced in #Roadman videos have the potential to become internalized as characteristics of all MLE speakers. And actually in the longer version of this talk, I show that comments on MLE speakers' TikTok videos, who in no way associate with this characterological figure, often refer to their roadman style. Okay, so just to wrap up now, I've spoken about 2 projects here with relation to the multi-ethnolect, multicultural London English. On the one hand, I've used a macro approach with my colleagues Jack Grieve and David Hall to look at the diffusion of MLE across the UK in terms of its general geographical distribution. In the second project, which I would have liked more time to speak about in more detail, but hopefully you got a good idea of what's going on there. It's very complex. It tells us about the recontextualization of multicultural London English. And the purpose of me bringing these 2 together is to better understand what is going on with MLE and how it's perceived in society. And what I'm arguing is that by bringing the macro and the micro together, we can fully understand sociolinguistic change. If I just looked at the macro, I only have kind of one part of the puzzle. If I bring in both approaches, I kind of have this holistic view of what's happening in relation to multicultural London English and sociolinguistic change. Okay, so this is my very last slide. Sorry, I realize that I'm a couple of minutes over. What I'm basically arguing, the takeaway, is that combining interactional and computational approaches is incredibly fruitful in understanding digital communication. We have already argued, I mean, all of us probably have argued this at some point, that the online-offline kind of dichotomy doesn't exist, and it doesn't make sense to kind of conceptualize digital and offline, but rather use digital data to understand what people do in kind of, if you want to call it, the real world, IRL, right? And I'm going to suggest that we don't need to think about big data or small data. It's just data, right? Like, if we really are committed to understanding sociolinguistic change, does it matter if it's big or small? Surely it's the data that allows us to answer what we're focused on, right? What topic we're interested in. So my general kind of end, here we are, is that we need to use a multi-pronged approach to fully understand sociolinguistic change. And the obvious example of this is in relation to the recontextualization of African-American vernacular English, which is problematically being perceived by many people as digital language, right? So this image here shows that many people perceive AV as Gen Z language or TikTok language. So hopefully you found that interesting, and there'll be some takeaway points. I understand there's time for questions now, so I'd be happy to answer them if you have them. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Christian, for this very rich and enticing talk. We have indeed like 10 minutes for discussion, and I here invite the audience to raise their yellow hands or to put any questions into the chat that we're going to take up and read aloud, but please use
Maybe
the opportunity.
I just start with a short question.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Just a question on the computational approach. So you were searching for 47 unambiguous MLE words, but do you think there's a potential to use this also to explore, maybe even identify, find new words that you were not aware when you started the study? First question, and then did you look for dynamics. So the data collection was, I think, 12 months. So did you look whether there was a change during this 12 months? And it was in 2014, so ages ago. What do you think, what has happened since then?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So I'll start with your second question first. So the short answer is, in that paper, we haven't looked at whether there was a change within the year, but that would be possible to do, I think, with that data set. I don't know how kind of insightful a year would be. We'd kind of want to compare with what's happening now. So I know that there's kind of, the reason why it's from 2014 is because if you know about APIs on Twitter, there was less limitations than there are now. And now collecting that data would be challenging, much more challenging. But I understand that James Stewart-Smith at Glasgow has found a workaround. So we could compare with the data that she's collected, definitely. I think that would be interesting. And in terms of the first question, about new words. So one of the reasons, again, why this is quite helpful to have a data set of 2014 is the words that we were using are from now, essentially. The words that we're aware of when I did my field work in like 2017, when Dave has done his work on MLE in like 2018, etc. So they're kind of looking retrospectively on words that we already knew had emerged or were in circulation. But yeah, I mean, in terms of new words, you could definitely use this to see, you know, the kind of seeds, I guess, of diffusion. And actually, that's something in the larger paper we draw out, is we look at words which are less diffused than others. Thanks.
I have a question in the chat by João Victor Pessoa, and João asks, do you intend to look at how Jamaican people perceive the Roadman dialect or register? How do you think they may react to it? Thank you.
Yeah, so it's not really linked to Jamaican English or Jamaican culture, right? So it is a Black British identity, and it has some reality, right? There are people in parts of society who probably would identify as roadmen, right? There's a great sociology dissertation on road life. So in terms of like going to and asking Jamaican individuals how they feel about it, it's probably not too relevant. And although it's inspired by, you know, the label is literally the same, you know, linguistic process of adding man to your profession, and it's got, you know, similar tropes, it's not really related to that culture.
Let's see. Any other questions? I think people are trying to digest all this wealth of information. I would use the time and ask a question while people are thinking along. So what would it look like if you combined the macro and micro approach and methodology within the same case study or within the same project? So if you were to have a macro take on the Roadman data, what would it look like?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, like, that's kind of, so it's not on MLE, obviously, but that's kind of what I was trying to do in like the Sassy Queen paper. It's like, sure, let's use a load of data, let's look at some general trends, and then like filter down into it and see what kind of patterns we emerge. I think what we really could do with that data set is look at like meta-linguistic commentaries of Roadman, right? So we have this huge data set, and just by doing, so one of the search terms that we track the diffusion of is Roadman itself. It was one of the highest linked to the MLE pattern. So if we then kind of got into that data set and then looked at where that term was being used and how it was being used, then I think that's one way we could combine both approaches. and it would probably be very helpful to my micro level analysis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can you, by the way, before I pass on, can you use, can you download the comments to the videos with the TikTok API as well? All right.
Yeah,
okay,
yes, that's one thing you can do.
That's great. Thank you for this. Now have Sabina Perino on the list. Go ahead.
Oh, you're on mute. Oh.
Sabina, you're on mute. Yes.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
I've not been using Zoom for a while because now I'm teaching in person. So I was just saying that I really appreciated your presentation, and I'm sorry that I came late. And I hope to be able to watch the recording of the first part of the presentation. But I have a question which is more like a methodological question that linked to the question that Janice just asked about, like the micro and the macro approach. Have you thought, I mean, this is really fascinating. Your work is fascinating in, you know, putting like one project on the macro and the other project on the micro makes total sense. However, I was thinking, have you ever thought about like using a more sort of like nuanced approach, such as like scales, you know, a scalar approach that would give you the possibility to see things in a more layered way? For example, there is this additive volume edited by Michael Lampert and Summerson Carr, which is called Scales. It was published, I think, in 2016. It's actually free online. You can download it from Oxford University Press. I don't remember the press, actually. But I think that approach would give you even more nuances that might actually be hidden by just using a macro and then a micro. You know, there are a lot of like midways in between the two approaches, and especially what Janice was suggesting, to put the two projects together. I think with the scalar approach, that would be absolutely, you know, very meaningful. I don't know if you ever thought about that. This is just like a comment that I have, but I'm really, really fascinated by your research. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I just quickly respond to that. So yeah, I mean, I was kind of being intentionally simplistic in terms of separating macro and micro out, because in the literature, right, I mean, like in terms of computational sociolinguistics, that is a macro level approach, right, that considers just general kind of population trends, whereas the interactional approach is kind of firmly within micro level approaches. So sure, yeah, I mean, in terms of scales, it would be, yeah, I completely agree. And I think my work is trying to do that, just probably not using that terminology in this talk. Thank you.
I will pass on to Paul Kurzweil, and then we have time for another question. Here you go.
Right, thanks for your talk, Christian. One thing I was wondering about as you're speaking, and I was also looking at a previous talk of yours in N-Wave, I think, which has some of the same points.
That's right.
And then something I've been writing as well with Jenny, and that is, you know, what is there a sense in which some words are intrinsically, quintessentially, something like that, Jamaican? Others are MLE, and that is ambiguously Jamaican, and then other things are MLE, but not Jamaican. I was thinking of the word Galdem, because, I mean, that strikes me as being, you know, it has a Jamaican phonology as well, which Mandem doesn't. You have you have the palatal thing at the beginning. And you actually said, I think in that talk, that is a Jamaican, and today as well, that it's a Jamaican term. And it patterns in a different way from the other MLE terms, in that it seems to sort of home in on centers of African Caribbean population. Mm-hmm. So, you know, is there then a scale, as was mentioned previously, between something that is essentially Jamaican and something that is more diffuse?
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so in the Twitter study, we intentionally separated out words that are common in Jamaican English because we didn't want kind of that geographical distribution affecting what we were looking for in terms of MLE, if that makes sense.
Mm.
So yeah, I think you're right. And the MLE words that we developed the list of were words that we refer to as like exclusively MLE. So like leng and nitty and roadman. Well, roadman doesn't. Yeah, roadman. They don't tend to occur in Jamaican English, right? Like leng and nitty, they are MLE terms.
Yeah.
And so sure, you get like gaudem and mandem and ting in Jamaican English. So we kind of treated those separately to try and tease out what is actually MLE and what is potentially used by other parts of, you know, other speakers of other varieties, in particular Jamaican English. And so I think that's why the kind of principal component analysis that finds one strong pattern is quite convincing, because it shows that that procedure worked to a degree, right? So but yeah, I think you're completely right. Like people will, you know, hear gaudem, and you know, for the majority of people that will be associated or indexical of Jamaican English, whereas I imagine in London people will have a much more kind of diverse indexical set for that, right? Because they probably hear kids on the bus there. Right?
That's interesting. Yeah, yeah. And then what about the link from there to blackness? You know, I mean, leng, since it's not a Jamaican word, I don't think, is it? But it's invented in London, so it doesn't have to be associated with that diaspora.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, yeah. I mean, I was speaking to you about this, but a student who at PhD I examined the other day has an explanation for this, right? Where kind of if it's non-standard, it just gets thrown into like it's associated with black speakers, kind of.
Okay. Yeah.
Indexical association. So there we go.
Thank you.
No worries.
Okay, if we had a very short and quick question, we could take it on board. If that is not the case, I am sure there will be follow-up questions which can be directed directly to Christian via email or over his Twitter account, which we saw on the slides as well. So thank you very much for this very rich and fascinating presentation, Christian. Thank you all for attending. Our next talk will be on the 20th of October by DiLCo with a more computational linguistic approach. I hope, and Heike and I hope to welcome you there as well. Take care. Bye-bye.
Cheers.